7th of August 1942 dawned with an eerie stillness over the Solomon Islands, but beneath that tropical calm churned a storm that would change the course of the Pacific War. The dense jungle canopy of Guadalcanal, an obscure speck in the vast ocean that most Americans had never heard of, was about to become the bloodiest proving ground of World War II. Major General Alexander Archer Vandegrift stood on the deck of the USS Macaulay, watching his 1st Marine Division prepare for the impossible, America's first major offensive operation against the Japanese Empire, launched just 8 months after Pearl Harbor's devastating surprise. The strategic calculus was brutally simple. Japanese forces had been constructing an airfield on Guadalcanal's northern coast, a base that would threaten the vital supply lines between America and Australia. If completed, this airstrip would extend Tokyo's reach across the Pacific like a strangling vine, cutting the lifeline that kept the Allied cause alive in the South Pacific. Intelligence reports, corroborated by Australian coast watchers hidden in the island's mountainous interior, confirmed that the Japanese were weeks away from completion. The Allies had to strike now, or risk losing the entire southern Pacific theater. As the first waves of landing craft churned toward Red Beach, Vandegrift understood the magnitude of what his Marines faced. According to reports referenced in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive naval histories, the operation represented an enormous gamble. The United States Navy could only guarantee air and naval support for a limited time before withdrawing to avoid Japanese counterattacks. The Marines would be landing with minimal supplies, incomplete intelligence, and the knowledge that they might be abandoned on a hostile shore thousands of miles from home. The invasion itself unfolded with surprising ease. Japanese construction workers, not combat troops, fled into the jungle as the Marines swarmed ashore. By nightfall on the 7th of August, American forces had secured the nearly completed airfield without firing a shot in anger. Vandegrift immediately ordered the base renamed Henderson Field, honoring Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway just 2 months earlier. The Marines had won the first round, but they had merely knocked on the door of hell. They had not yet stepped inside. What the weary Marines discovered on Guadalcanal shocked them. The island was not the tropical paradise of Hollywood imagination, but a fetid nightmare. Malaria-carrying mosquitoes swarmed in clouds. Crocodiles lurked in the rivers. The heat was suffocating, turning uniforms into sweat-soaked rags within minutes. Fungal infections bloomed on skin. Dysentery ravaged digestive systems. The jungle itself seemed alive with malevolence, a green wall that concealed danger at every turn. Yet the environmental horrors paled compared to what approached from the north. Japanese commanders, stunned by the audacity of the American assault, immediately began planning their response. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa assembled a strike force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer, racing south through the waters that would soon earn the grimly appropriate nickname Iron Bottom Sound. The Imperial Japanese Navy had dominated every major surface engagement since the war began. Their crews were veteran warriors, their tactics refined through years of aggressive training, their torpedoes, the deadly Type 93 Long Lance, vastly superior to anything the Americans possessed. They were coming to teach the upstart Americans a lesson in naval warfare, and that lesson would be written in fire and blood. 9th of August 1942 became a date of infamy rivaling Pearl Harbor itself, though far fewer Americans would remember its significance. In the pre-dawn darkness, Vice Admiral Mikawa's strike force slipped past the Allied screening forces with shocking ease, exploiting gaps in the patrol patterns and aided by tropical rainstorms that masked their approach. The Allied cruisers USS Astoria, USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, HMAS Canberra, and USS Chicago lay at anchor off Savo Island, their crews exhausted from 2 days of combat operations, many sleeping at their battle stations. At 1:43 in the morning, Japanese searchlights suddenly blazed across the water, illuminating the Allied warships like actors on a stage. The Long Lance torpedoes were already in the water, their oxygen-fueled engines leaving no telltale wakes as they raced toward their targets. What followed was not a battle but a massacre. Within 32 minutes, 4 Allied cruisers were sinking or ablaze. Over 1,000 sailors were dead or dying, and Mikawa's force had sustained only minimal damage. The Battle of Savo Island represented the worst defeat in the history of the United States Navy, a humiliation so complete that it would take decades for the full story to be publicly acknowledged. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding the amphibious forces, faced an agonizing decision. His transports were vulnerable, his screening force shattered, and Japanese aircraft from Rabaul would arrive with dawn's light. He made the only choice possible. He ordered the fleet to withdraw, taking with it the supplies and heavy equipment still aboard the cargo ships. The Marines on Guadalcanal watched in disbelief as their lifeline steamed over the horizon, leaving them stranded with perhaps 30 days of rations, limited ammunition, and incomplete fortifications. They had been abandoned on Guadalcanal, exactly as they had feared. Sergeant Mitchell Page, a young Marine machine gunner from Pennsylvania, later described the mood that descended over Henderson Field. The men felt betrayed, isolated on what some began calling Starvation Island. They subsisted on captured Japanese rice, supplemented by occasional airdrops and whatever supplies could be smuggled through on fast destroyers, making midnight runs that would become known as the Tokyo Express. The Marines ate poorly, slept in flooded foxholes, and watched comrades sicken with malaria at alarming rates. Medical supplies dwindled. Quinine, the only defense against the mosquito-borne plague, became more valuable than ammunition. Yet Vandegrift refused to let despair take root. He organized his perimeter into a defensive position that stretched from the Ilu River on the east to the Matanikau River on the west, creating a roughly semicircular shield around Henderson Field. The airstrip itself became the campaign's focal point, the objective that both sides would sacrifice everything to control. Without Henderson Field, the Japanese could not dominate the surrounding waters. Without Henderson Field, the Marines could not receive supplies or air support. Everything hinged on those 3,600 feet of crushed coral and steel matting. The first aircraft arrived on 20th of August, 19 Grumman Wildcats and 12 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers that somehow managed to land on the roughly finished strip. These pilots and planes, which would become famous as the Cactus Air Force, using Guadalcanal's code name, were a ragtag collection of Marine, Navy, and eventually Army aviators flying patched-together aircraft held together with salvaged parts and sheer determination. They faced overwhelming odds. Japanese bombers from Rabaul, over 500 miles to the northwest, raided Henderson Field almost daily, preceded by the Coast Watchers' warning calls over the teleradio network. Condition red. 21st of August, 1942 marked the beginning of Japanese ground operations designed to recapture Henderson Field through swift, aggressive assault. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, commanding roughly 900 soldiers of the elite 28th Infantry Regiment, landed east of the Marine perimeter with orders to sweep aside American resistance and seize the airfield immediately. Ichiki embodied the Imperial Japanese Army's doctrine of seishin, spiritual strength overcoming material disadvantage through sheer willpower and warrior spirit. His men had participated in the capture of Guam and were veterans of combat in China. They despised their enemy as weak, decadent Americans who would crumble under determined attack. Ichiki's contempt would cost him everything. The colonel divided his force, sending his main body in a frontal assault across the sandbar at the mouth of Alligator Creek, which American maps incorrectly labeled the Ilu River. He expected the Marines to retreat in disorder. Instead, he encountered Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, dug into carefully prepared positions with interlocking fields of fire. When Ichiki's troops charged in the early morning darkness of 21st of August, screaming battle cries and brandishing bayonets fixed to their Arisaka rifles, they ran directly into a wall of machine gun fire. The Battle of the Tenaru, misnamed because it actually occurred at Alligator Creek, became a slaughter. Marine machine gunners, including Sergeant John Basilone, who would later receive the Medal of Honor for actions in October, cut down wave after wave of attackers. Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated never to surrender, charged repeatedly into certain death. By dawn, hundreds of bodies lay heaped on the sandbar and riverbanks. Vandegrift committed his reserve, sending tanks to roll up the Japanese flanks. The Stuart light tanks, affectionately called Honey by their crews, ground across the battlefield, crushing wounded enemy soldiers who refused to surrender, a grim necessity that haunted the American tankers for years afterward. Colonel Ichiki, witnessing the annihilation of his command, burned his regimental colors and committed ritual suicide. Of his roughly 900 men, only a handful escaped back to Japanese lines. American casualties numbered 44 killed. The lopsided victory demonstrated that Japanese infantry, despite their fearsome reputation and fanatical courage, could be defeated by disciplined American forces in prepared defensive positions. Yet the victory also revealed a disturbing truth. The Japanese would rather die to the last man than surrender, turning every battle into a fight of extermination. This source material draws upon the extensive documentation found in Richard Frank's authoritative work, Guadalcanal, the definitive account of the landmark battle, which meticulously reconstructed these events through interviews with veterans and archival research. The pattern established at the Tenaru would repeat throughout the campaign. Japanese commanders consistently underestimated American fighting capabilities while overestimating the power of spiritual motivation to overcome firepower. This fatal combination of arrogance and tactical inflexibility would cost Japan dearly in the months ahead. Meanwhile, the Tokyo Express, American sailors' sardonic nickname for the high-speed destroyer runs that the Japanese called rat operations, began operating in earnest. Every few nights, Japanese destroyers raced down the slot, the narrow passage through the Solomon Islands chain, to bombard Henderson Field and deliver reinforcements to the growing Japanese forces west of the marine perimeter. The destroyers traveled at speeds exceeding 30 knots, arriving after dusk and departing before dawn, staying beyond the range of Henderson Field's aircraft. These runs were commanded by Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, a brilliant tactician who would prove to be one of Japan's finest naval commanders. 12th of September through 14th of September, 1942 witnessed some of the most desperate close-quarters combat in American military history, fought along a jungle ridge south of Henderson Field that would be immortalized as Edson's Ridge or Bloody Ridge. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi had landed approximately 6,000 troops of his 35th Infantry Brigade west of the marine perimeter, then spent days maneuvering through nearly impenetrable jungle to approach Henderson Field from the south, the direction Vandegrift had fortified least heavily. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Austin Edson, commanding the 1st Marine Raider Battalion and 1st Parachute Battalion, held the ridge with roughly 800 exhausted Marines. Edson was a lean, hard-bitten officer nicknamed Red Mike for his red hair and ruthless tactical efficiency. He understood immediately what Kawaguchi intended: to overwhelm the southern defenses through nighttime assault, break through to Henderson Field, and destroy the American air capability in one decisive stroke. Everything depended on whether Edson's thin line could hold. The first Japanese probing attacks came on the night of 12th of September, feeling out the Marine positions. Edson, recognizing the danger, pulled his forces back to a narrower, more defensible section of the ridge. The following night brought the main assault. Kawaguchi committed his entire force in coordinated attacks from multiple directions, supported by artillery and mortar fire. Japanese infantry surged up the slopes in waves, bayonets gleaming in the light of flares and tracers. They fought with terrifying ferocity, breaking through the Marine lines in several places, penetrating to within 1,000 yards of Henderson Field itself. Edson stood at the center of the maelstrom, personally rallying his men at critical moments. When one position faltered, he appeared from the darkness with reinforcements. When communications broke down, he ran messages himself. His raiders and para-marines fought hand-to-hand with entrenching tools, knives, and fists when their ammunition ran low. Artillery batteries at Henderson Field depressed their barrels to nearly horizontal, firing directly into the attacking Japanese formations at point-blank range. The concussion of the shells so close that American defenders bled from their ears. For 2 nights the battle raged. Marines called in artillery strikes on their own positions when Japanese soldiers overran their foxholes. Machine gunners fired until their barrels glowed red, and ammunition bearers collapsed from exhaustion carrying belts forward. The jungle became a nightmare landscape of muzzle flashes, screams, and the wet sounds of steel meeting flesh. Japanese officers wielding samurai swords inherited from ancestors led charges up the slopes, only to be cut down by Marine rifle fire. The cultural clash could not have been more stark. Ancient Bushido warrior traditions colliding with modern American firepower. By dawn on 14th of September, Kawaguchi's offensive had shattered. He had lost roughly 1,200 men killed with many more wounded. The survivors staggered back into the jungle, their ammunition exhausted, their morale broken. Edson's forces, reduced to fewer than 500 effective combatants, held the ridge. For his leadership during those desperate nights, Edson received the Medal of Honor. The Battle of Edson's Ridge had been the closest the Japanese came to recapturing Henderson Field, and they had failed. The turning point had been reached, though months of brutal combat still lay ahead. The naval war around Guadalcanal intensified throughout September and October of 1942, transforming the waters between Guadalcanal, Florida Island, Tulagi, and Savo Island into a graveyard. So many ships from both navies would be sunk in these confined waters that sailors began calling it Iron Bottom Sound, a name that would stick permanently. The fighting afloat proved just as savage as the land campaign, a series of confused night engagements fought at point-blank range where technology mattered less than training, luck, and raw courage. 11th of October brought the Battle of Cape Esperance, a confused midnight clash that showed American surface forces beginning to learn from their earlier defeats. Rear Admiral Norman Scott, commanding a force of cruisers and destroyers, managed to cross the T of a Japanese reinforcement convoy, achieving the classic naval tactical advantage where one's broadside could fire at the enemy while their ships could only return fire from forward guns. The Americans sank one Japanese cruiser and one destroyer, damaging others, while losing one destroyer themselves. It was hardly a decisive victory, but after months of defeats, it provided a desperately needed morale boost. Yet the Japanese responded with characteristic determination. On 13th through 14th of October, battleships Congo and Haruna sailed boldly into Guadalcanal's waters and subjected Henderson Field to the most devastating bombardment of the campaign. For over 90 minutes, the battleships fired 14-inch shells directly at the airfield from ranges so close they could hardly miss. The bombardment destroyed 48 aircraft, killed 41 men, ignited fuel dumps, cratered the runway, and left the field temporarily inoperable. Marines huddled in their dugouts as the earth heaved under the impact of shells designed to penetrate battleship armor. The bombardment demonstrated Japan's continuing naval superiority in surface engagements and their willingness to risk capital ships in confined waters, something the American Navy remained reluctant to do. For the Marines, already subsisting on reduced rations and racked by disease, the battleship bombardment represented a new low. Some men openly speculated about evacuation. The Japanese followed up by landing reinforcements and supplies from 6 transports, boldly beaching them in broad daylight under air attack. Though American aircraft and artillery destroyed 3 transports and killed many Japanese soldiers during the unloading, enough troops and supplies got ashore to support another major offensive. 26th of October witnessed the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, a carrier engagement fought northeast of Guadalcanal that further illustrated the campaign's brutal mathematics. The Japanese combined fleet, seeking to annihilate American carrier strength, engaged USS Enterprise and USS Hornet with 4 carriers of their own. The resulting battle saw Hornet sunk and Enterprise severely damaged, but Japanese losses proved irreplaceable. Over 100 aircraft shot down along with their highly trained, virtually irreplaceable aircrews. Japan was winning tactical victories while bleeding itself dry of the veteran pilots who made those victories possible. Admiral William Halsey, who replaced Vice Admiral Robert Gormley as Commander South Pacific Area on 18th of October, brought aggressive new energy to the Allied effort. Halsey's first message to Guadalcanal read simply, "Jesus Christ and General MacArthur, hold on." His appointment signaled Washington's renewed commitment to the campaign. Supplies began flowing more freely. Reinforcements arrived, including the Army's Americal Division. The Marines would not be abandoned. Yet Halsey inherited a precarious situation. American naval strength in the South Pacific was stretched to breaking, while Japanese determination to recapture Guadalcanal showed no signs of weakening. 23rd of October through 26th of October, 1942 marked Japan's most sustained and dangerous offensive operation against the marine perimeter. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake had arrived on Guadalcanal personally to command over 20,000 troops of the 17th Army, confident that this force would finally sweep the Americans into the sea. The plan was complex, calling for coordinated attacks from multiple directions designed to fragment marine defenses before delivering the killing blow. Hyakutake established his headquarters deep in the jungle south of Henderson Field, certain he would soon be broadcasting victory from the captured American airstrip. The main effort would come from the south, where Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama would lead the 2nd Division through the jungle to assault the same general area where Kawaguchi had failed in September. This time, however, the attack would be supported by diversionary assaults from the west across the Matanikau River and from the east near the coast. Japanese planners expected the Americans to shift reserves to meet each threat, weakening the southern defenses for Maruyama's decisive penetration. Naval forces would support by bombarding the airfield and engaging any American warships that attempted to interfere. Maruyama's approach march became an ordeal that foreshadowed the offensive's failure. The 2nd Division, considered one of Japan's finest fighting formations, spent days hacking through jungles so dense that progress was measured in yards per hour. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion. The division's artillery had to be abandoned when the terrain proved impassable for heavy equipment. Rations ran low. Malaria struck down hundreds. The march that planners estimated would take 3 days required nearly a week, disrupting the carefully orchestrated timeline for the multi-pronged assault. When Maruyama's exhausted soldiers finally reached their attack positions on 23rd of October, they found themselves facing the 7th Marine Regiment under Colonel Chesty Puller, one of the most aggressive and capable combat leaders in American military history. Puller had spent the previous week strengthening his defenses, laying barbed wire, positioning machine guns for interlocking fields of fire, and registering artillery concentrations along likely approaches. His Marines were tired, malnourished, and disease-ridden, but they occupied superb defensive positions and possessed ample ammunition. The Japanese attacks began after nightfall on 23rd of October and continued with suicidal intensity for 4 nights. Maruyama's troops emerged from the jungle in tight formations, advancing with fixed bayonets while officers waved swords and NCOs beat drums. They ran directly into storms of machine gun and rifle fire. Artillery shells burst among them. Mortars dropped high explosive rounds into their assault columns. Still they came on, climbing over the bodies of their dead comrades, driven by orders that forbade retreat and by propaganda that portrayed Americans as cowards who would flee before determined attack. Sergeant John Basilone, commanding 2 machine gun sections in Puller's line, became the embodiment of Marine Corps defensive doctrine during the night of 24th through 25th of October. When his gunners fell wounded or dead, Basilone moved between positions, firing weapons himself, clearing jams, running ammunition through enemy fire. At one point, he hauled a red-hot machine gun barrel back to the rear for repair, burning his hands and arms severely. His section held against waves of attackers, leaving Japanese dead stacked in front of their positions. For his actions that night, Basilone received the Medal of Honor, one of 3 awarded for the fighting around the perimeter during October. The diversionary attack across the Matanikau River similarly met disaster. Japanese infantry attempted to force the river under heavy fire, only to be cut down in the water or pinned on the far bank. American artillery turned the crossing sites into killing grounds. Tank infantry counterattacks drove back those units that managed to establish shallow bridgeheads. By dawn, the river ran red with blood. The Japanese had gained nothing except staggering casualty lists. Estimates suggest that over 2,000 Japanese soldiers died in the attacks around the marine perimeter between 23rd and 26th of October, while Marine casualties numbered fewer than 200. November of 1942 brought the campaign to its climax in a series of naval engagements that would determine Guadalcanal's fate. Both sides had poured resources into the Solomons until the campaign had become a zero-sum struggle, Whoever withdrew first would forfeit not just the island but potentially the entire Pacific theater. Japanese commanders, stung by repeated ground defeats, decided to stake everything on one massive reinforcement operation that would land overwhelming force on Guadalcanal. American intelligence, reading Japanese naval codes through the Ultra program, knew the blow was coming but could do little except prepare for the onslaught. 12th through 15th of November witnessed what historians would call the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, actually a series of savage night engagements that represented some of the most brutal surface combat in naval history. On the night of 12th through 13th of November, a Japanese bombardment force of 2 battleships, 1 cruiser, and 14 destroyers approached Guadalcanal, intending to pound Henderson Field into permanent uselessness before the main troop convoy arrived. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan, commanding 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers, sailed directly into the Japanese formation in a desperate attempt to stop them. What followed was chaos. The 2 forces collided at ranges so close that large ships could not depress their main batteries enough to engage, forcing crews to fight with secondary armament and sometimes small arms. Ships from both sides intermingled in the darkness, firing at anything that moved. Friend and foe became indistinguishable. The cruiser USS Atlanta took fire from both Japanese and American ships, including her sister ship USS San Francisco. Admiral Callahan was killed on San Francisco's bridge by a shell hit. The cruiser USS Juno was so badly damaged, she had to withdraw. 4 American destroyers sank in the confusion, yet Callahan's sacrifice achieved its purpose. The battleship Hiei, pride of the Japanese fleet, absorbed enough damage that she could not withdraw with the other Japanese ships. American aircraft from Henderson Field found her at dawn on 13th of November, limping northward, and sank her with repeated bombing and torpedo attacks. It was the first Japanese battleship lost in the war, a symbolic victory of immense proportions. More importantly, Callahan's desperate assault had forced the Japanese bombardment force to withdraw before completing their mission. Henderson Field remained operational. The Japanese tried again on 14th through 15th of November, sending the battleship Kirishima, with 4 cruisers and 9 destroyers, back to Guadalcanal. This time they encountered Rear Admiral Willis Lee commanding 2 battleships, USS Washington and USS South Dakota, with 4 destroyers. The Battle of Guadalcanal reached its climax in this engagement. Japanese destroyers torpedoed and sank 3 American destroyers in rapid succession. South Dakota's electrical system failed catastrophically, leaving her blind and vulnerable. Japanese ships subjected her to concentrated fire, hitting her superstructure repeatedly. Then USS Washington, which had maneuvered unseen in the darkness, opened fire. Admiral Lee's flagship possessed the most advanced radar and fire control systems in the Pacific, allowing Washington to engage Kirishima at ranges where the Japanese battleship could not effectively return fire. Washington's 16-inch guns pummeled Kirishima with 75 hits in just 7 minutes, reducing the Japanese battleship to a burning wreck. Kirishima sank before dawn. The Japanese were forced to withdraw again, their second battleship lost in 3 days. But the Japanese troop convoy, 11 transports escorted by destroyers, continued southward despite the naval disasters. American aircraft from Henderson Field and from Enterprise attacked throughout 13th and 14th of November, sinking 7 transports. The remaining 4, their decks crowded with troops and supplies, beached themselves on Guadalcanal's coast in a last desperate attempt to deliver their cargo. American artillery and aircraft subjected the beached transports to sustained fire throughout the day, killing thousands of Japanese soldiers before they could disembark. Few supplies were salvaged. The November operation, Japan's maximum effort to recapture Guadalcanal, had ended in catastrophic failure. 30th of November, 1942 brought the Battle of Tassafaronga, a final demonstration that Japanese naval skill still posed formidable danger despite their strategic position deteriorating. Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka, commanding 8 destroyers on another Tokyo Express run, encountered 5 American cruisers and 4 destroyers under Rear Admiral Carlton Wright. The Americans had radar advantage and numerical superiority. Victory should have been certain. Instead, Tanaka executed a masterful tactical withdrawal, launching his deadly long-lance torpedoes before retreating into the darkness. The results shocked the U.S. Navy. The cruiser USS Northampton sank. Cruisers USS Minneapolis, USS New Orleans, and USS Pensacola were so severely damaged that they would be out of action for months. American casualties exceeded 400. Japanese losses amounted to 1 destroyer sunk. The battle proved that tactical skill could still overcome technological and numerical advantages, but it also proved strategically meaningless. The Tokyo Express could no longer deliver enough supplies to sustain Japanese forces on Guadalcanal. Tanaka's tactical brilliance could not change the fundamental reality that Japan was losing the campaign. By December of 1942, the strategic situation had shifted decisively. The Marines on Guadalcanal, reinforced by Army divisions and increasingly well-supplied, began expanding their perimeter westward along the coast. The Japanese 17th Army, decimated by combat losses and ravaged by disease and starvation, retreated deeper into the jungle. Where Japanese troops had attacked in regimental strength just months earlier, they now survived on handfuls of rice and coconuts. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and simple malnutrition killed more Japanese soldiers than American weapons. The campaign had become a race between American offensive operations and the rate at which disease and starvation were destroying the Japanese garrison. 9th of December marked an important transition when the 1st Marine Division, which had fought on Guadalcanal since the initial landing in August, was finally relieved and evacuated to Australia. Of approximately 16,000 Marines who landed in August, over 1,200 had been killed in action, nearly 3,000 wounded, and over 5,000 evacuated due to disease, particularly malaria. The division was a hollow shell of its former strength, yet those Marines had accomplished something extraordinary. They had stopped Japanese expansion in the Pacific and proved that the seemingly invincible Imperial forces could be defeated. Major General Alexander Patch's American Division and the Army's 25th Infantry Division assumed responsibility for completing the campaign. Patch, unlike his Marine predecessors, commanded sufficient forces to conduct offensive operations rather than merely defending a perimeter. Throughout January of 1943, American forces systematically compressed the Japanese pocket westward, clearing the coast and pushing inland. The advance was methodical rather than rapid, prioritizing American casualties over speed, a luxury that Vandegrift had never enjoyed during the desperate early months. The Japanese High Command faced an agonizing decision. The 17th Army on Guadalcanal was doomed. The only question was whether to let those soldiers die in place or attempt an evacuation that would risk precious naval resources to save what remained of a defeated army. Emperor Hirohito, informed of the situation's gravity, authorized a withdrawal, Japan's first retreat of the Pacific War. Between 1st and 7th of February 1943, Japanese destroyers evacuated over 10,000 survivors from Cape Esperance on Guadalcanal's northwestern tip. Admiral Tanaka again commanded the operation, executing it with his characteristic skill. The Tokyo Express, which had brought supplies and reinforcements for 6 months, made its final runs to evacuate the starving survivors. 9th of February, 1943 finally brought official confirmation of what American patrols had discovered the previous day. Japanese resistance on Guadalcanal had ceased. General Patch sent his famous message to Admiral Halsey. Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal. The 6-month campaign was over. The island, purchased with so much blood and sacrifice, was firmly in American hands. Henderson Field, the objective that both sides had fought so desperately to control, now served as a major Allied air base for operations further up the Solomon chain. The butcher's bill was staggering. American forces suffered approximately 7,000 dead or missing, with over 7,000 wounded and thousands more incapacitated by disease. Naval losses included 2 fleet carriers, 8 cruisers, and 14 destroyers sunk, though American industrial capacity was already replacing these losses with new construction. Japanese casualties were catastrophic, over 20,000 soldiers dead on Guadalcanal itself, most from disease and starvation rather than combat. Naval losses included 2 battleships, 1 fleet carrier, 4 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Japan's irreplaceable loss of trained aircraft pilots, over 600 experienced aviators killed, would handicap Japanese naval aviation for the rest of the war. The Guadalcanal Campaign represented far more than a tactical victory on an obscure island. It marked the psychological turning point of the Pacific War. Japan's aura of invincibility, carefully cultivated since Pearl Harbor, shattered against the coral and jungle of the Solomons. American forces, derided in Japanese propaganda as soft and decadent, had proven capable of enduring hardship, accepting casualties, and prevailing through determination equal to Japan's vaunted warrior spirit. The campaign demonstrated that American industrial capacity, when fully mobilized, could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. For the individual soldiers, sailors, and Marines who fought there, Guadalcanal remained a defining experience. Veterans spoke of the campaign in tones mixing pride and horror, pride in having survived and prevailed, horror at the conditions they had endured, and the friends they had lost. The island's name entered American military lore alongside Belleau Wood and the Argonne Forest. John Hersey's reporting from Guadalcanal, published in Life magazine, helped Americans on the home front understand the campaign's significance and the sacrifices being made in their name. The strategic consequences rippled throughout the Pacific. Japan, forced onto the defensive for the first time, could never again mount sustained offensive operations. The initiative had passed permanently to the Allies. MacArthur's forces could now advance through New Guinea toward the Philippines. Nimitz's forces could begin the island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific. Both prongs of the Allied offensive traced directly back to the victory at Guadalcanal, the hinge upon which the Pacific War turned. The campaign also taught brutal lessons about amphibious warfare, combined operations, and the nature of modern combat in jungle terrain. American forces learned to coordinate air, naval, and ground operations in ways that would prove invaluable in future campaigns. They learned that victory required not just defeating the enemy, but maintaining supply lines across vast ocean distances. They learned that disease could be as deadly as enemy fire, and that tropical warfare demanded new tactics, equipment, and medical procedures. By 1943's end, Guadalcanal had become a rear area base, its jungles cleared, its coast lined with supply dumps and facilities, its airfields expanded into major installations. The blood-soaked battlefields where Marines and Japanese soldiers had fought to mutual exhaustion were now supply depots and motor pools. Henderson Field, once cratered by battleship shells and littered with wrecked aircraft, now hosted hundreds of planes preparing for operations against Rabaul and beyond. The island that nobody wanted in August of 1942 had become a cornerstone of Allied power projection in the South Pacific. Iron Bottom Sound, that grave of ships and sailors from both nations, remained the campaign's most haunting legacy. Over 50 warships lay on the bottom, along with countless transport vessels, cargo ships, and small craft. Thousands of men had died in those waters, trapped in sinking ships or fighting in oil-slicked seas. Divers exploring the wrecks decades later found bones still at battle stations, a silent testimony to the savagery of the naval engagements. The waters that once ran red with blood now ran blue again, but the iron hulls beneath the waves ensured that Guadalcanal's sacrifice would never be forgotten. The campaign had ended, but its echoes would resound through history, a testament to courage, endurance, and the terrible price of turning the tide of war.